Welcome to Natural Family Planning Office Hours. I'm your host, Theresa Notare, Assistant Director of the Natural Family Planning Program at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Let's begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Heart of Jesus, burning furnace of love, inflame our hearts for love of you and our neighbors. Send us your Holy Spirit that we may be animated by his love and give glory to God the Father in our lives. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our topic today is natural family planning services and Catholic hospitals. What does it look like? How does it work? Who's doing what, where? And to guide this conversation, we have two experts who are our guests today. They're from Ascension Healthcare Systems, and they are Mark Repenshek and Elliott Bedford. And I'll just tell you a little bit about them right now so that we'll put the fuller description of their backgrounds in the descriptor of this video when we're done meeting. So Mark is the Vice President of Ethics and Church Relations for Ascension, and he earned his PhD in Healthcare Ethics at St. Louis University at the Center for Healthcare Ethics. And with Elliott, he is the, he arrived at Ascension at 2014, and he served as Director of Ethics Integration for Ascension St. Vincent in Central and Southern Indiana. And since 2020, also served as Director of Ethics Integration, Ascension Via Christi in Kansas. And there's oodles of information more, as I said, that we can say about these two fine gentlemen who have been devoting their lives to this work. And I'll just pass it on to both of you to first say welcome. I'm again so grateful that you're here with us. And why don't you share your screen now so we can begin our conversation.
Well, let me push that gratitude right back to you all. We couldn't be more pleased to be offered this invitation to be with you today. I think the importance of highlighting the roles that Elliott and I share is that you're going to get, and it's kind of in the title of the slide already, this idea of a systems-based approach, meaning that without Elliott's great work and leadership and collaboration with his teams in the Indiana and Kansas market, I'd be sitting at the system office with just maybe some tools. And at the same time, if I might suggest, and Elliott, feel free to correct, without kind of the coordinated work at the system level, this ends up becoming episodic and very contingent upon opportunities in certain areas, but not a strategic system-based approach across the whole. So the complementarity of our two roles and the willingness and the ability to work collaboratively has been absolutely critical. One other caveat that I just want to acknowledge in terms of gratitude is, and we'll talk about this a bit later, this work has been done in complement with so many other disciplines. Leadership, clinical leadership, strong advocates in the work, the practitioners themselves. And we are just beginning the work to say, okay, let's make sure we kind of take care of our shop internally. And then as we're doing that, now let's figure out how we can strategically align with all of you at the diocesan level. And what might that look like? So we're not there yet. There's all kinds of ways that we can improve on the work that we're doing. But I would say for Ascension, this is our first systems-based approach to this. And Elliott will cover some of this work that he's been doing for years in many markets and others, trying to get this movement in this space that has been much more kind of maybe at the hospital level or a clinical level. So that's really the main kind of focus for today. And that really kind of leads to two major objectives for what we want to try to cover today. Let me get this out of the way here, sorry. Kind of illustrating the context, kind of how we got to this point, right? Given the fact that we are in 37 dioceses, We still span nearly 140 inpatient sites of care, thousands of physicians as a part of our system. How do we begin to think about a strategy on a scale of that magnitude? And then to kind of invite conversation and collaboration across those stakeholder groups to advance FABM in our communities. And that's really our main objectives for today. So current state, what I'd like to do is have Elliott talk a little bit about what has been that work that he and others have led in many of the markets, some of our other directors, and kind of what he saw and where we had kind of the first indication that's not a sustainable strategy. Elliott?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. So I've worked here in the Indiana market for about since 2014, and been able to have really good relationships with lots of clinicians at various different levels of the organization, whether they're frontline family care physicians, or we've got a high-risk maternal fetal medicine program, and being able to understand kind of the world and culture that they live in. It's no surprise to you that the kind of the dominant paradigm within medicine is very highly promotive of contraceptives, and that's just kind of the norm. So when we look at this of saying, how do we effectively find a way to live out the church's exhortation to promote fertility awareness or natural family planning, it was trying to find a way to be, our strategy really, to be able to, one, kind of understand where the current culture is and what the kind of roadblocks are to be able to help promote within the health system this awareness of, acceptance of natural family planning as a viable alternative that should be offered to patients. And that kind of gives you an indication, if you want to advance the slide, of how we wanted to kind of get the lay of the land. And what happened was, we said, as we have these conversations, there's no magic bullet. There is so many dimensions to this very thorny problem of the way that the medical culture is that we kind of like inherit as employers. But then how do we go about and create something new? Well, there's no one simple path. So what we did is we had to approach this from multiple different angles or dimensions. And the first step in being able to do that is to understand what are the, if you think of this as like a gem or a diamond, how many different facets do we have to identify before we can even start to map out a plan for how to move the culture in one way or another. And so you see here on the slide, we identified at least 7 different dimensions of a systems thinking approach to make sure that if we're going to try and live out this this commitment to the church's teaching, here's how we have to partition or break things up. Or it's not necessarily a sequence 1 through 7. It's more of a, these are different dimensions of all of the same issue that we're trying to tackle. And so what you'd find is these different things like policy, personnel, infrastructure, like our electronic medical record, all of these kind of play off of one another because personnel are constantly changing, policies are being updated and consolidated, education platforms that we can provide are updating and changing, not just based on this one particular need, but how Ascension is approaching things on a national level. And so you have all these different mix of factors that make it very complex. And so I kind of feel like the image that I've had is like you got a big sack of bowling balls that you're trying to roll up a hill all at once, and there's pieces falling back, and how do you move up there? But you're able to do it when you're able to kind of coordinate on a system level, exactly like Mark said. So if this was just Elliott in Indiana trying to accomplish something, it'd be an impossible task. But by having people like Mark and others, leaders within the organization, have an eye on one of these dimensions of the systems approach, you're able to make progress. Granted, it might be slower than we would all desire, but there is definitely an opportunity for cultural shift because of we've taken the time to appreciate the complexity of the problem. I think that
Yeah,
that's something. Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
yeah, let me just give you a few examples. Elliot, you're spot on. And I think where we would acknowledge some of the starts and stops. So one of our initial thoughts, and we heard this by asking the clinicians, right? What do you need to help make this a strategy that you can engage, right? Oh, that's unintentional. Sorry, hold on.
So Mark is saying that we had to develop an approach where it was very much listening to the clinicians rather than we would come up with an idea and say, hey, we want you to implement this. We would sit there and understand in dialogue and say, this is what we need to promote for the ethical and religious directives. How do you see this being able to be appropriate and integrated into the work that you're already doing? And how can we help you meet a need with this work that we're trying to accomplish?
Exactly.
And that pathway in was very much people were receptive of it. And I would also add kind of the way we learned to talk about the issue has been something that is also, we'll get to it a little bit later in the slide deck here, but it's a reframing that's important specifically within the healthcare context that allows this to be, rather than like we're just simply promoting the moral teaching of the church, that's not necessarily the language that medicine hears most immediately, but if you weave into their language, the medical model of professionalism around informed consent, you have a much easier time having a conversation. So I know that's where you're going, Mark.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think, to acknowledge the fact that this didn't just occur in a couple of years and like, oh, yay, we finally figured this out. The starts and stops that were so much a part of our own understanding of systems thinking. We started in a few markets with policy because that's what the clinicians told us they wanted. They're like, look, if we just had a policy that helped us lay out what we're obligated to and how we do that, let's establish that. Let's start there. Well, oh, yes, please, Theresa. Yep.
Just for the sake of clarity, I'm wondering in a system as large as Ascension, does every hospital have an education department and an ethicist? And so just the practicalities of trying to reach out, you said you were talking to clinicians. Well, are they the people in an education department in a hospital? Who are they?
Yeah, so great. So where we started, where we thought we needed to start was from a practice standpoint, right? We were viewing this as a practice change. So we were talking with most of our OBs, internal med, family med, and going directly to our medical groups and saying, okay, look, you already know and understand and appreciate what it means to abide by the ERDs relative to your practice. Let's talk specifically about a particular ERD relative to natural family planning and what this might mean. Well, that led to this conversation around policy, right? And it's a natural place for clinicians to go, right? Lean into that space, give us the policy, give us the guide. Great, now we can go execute. The problem from a systems standpoint or a systems thinking standpoint is it at times came across as nothing more than what it was, which is a policy, which can be viewed sometimes as a bludgeon, right? And it's like, if you pound the nail enough, right? We just hoped that magically this kind of program would be supported and spurred on by virtue of what was asked for. And what we
to that point, it didn't that approach never gains buy-in, which is a key phenomenon that we're looking for where it's not simply just like these are the rules that I need to follow, but we need to see the value and how this brings value to my relationship with my patients is something we learned in that approach, where it was just when they said, hey, we need a policy and responded as such, this is one of the shadow sides of that approach.
And I know that probably seems obvious to many of you. You're probably like, well, duh. Given how large you are, how would that possibly? But because, as Elliott said, because it was what was asked for, we thought, okay, we're meeting a need, right? Well, we're meeting a need, but it's a very small slice of what it means to take a comprehensive system-based approach. And as a result, to be just very honest about it, that sputtered. It also became obvious to us that that became person dependent. And what that means for us is that it became a relationship with a clinician or a clinician lead. And in an organization our size, the reality is we just have turnover. And if the program is tied to the individual, so too goes the program with the individual. And what we realized very quickly is we needed triadic relationships that were going to be clinician and administrator and operations and strategy and communications and data management. We needed to pull in those persons that were going to give us all of those levers that we can pull, so that when the clinician says, this is great, I'd love to do it, but you know what, in a busy office visit, I've got all of these things I need to cover. I've got an EMR metrics I need to hit. How am I going to possibly attend to this piece? Great, let's remove the friction for you. And we'll talk a bit more about that, what that means in terms of the actual practical tools. But we couldn't get there until we had the understanding that individuals and processes from all 7 of these areas needed to be a part of our comprehensive approach.
And the reality is, on that point, we're still living into that experience. It's not like we figured it out. We just recognize kind of the woods in which we're walking. And so it's something that's exciting to have that level of clarity, but also kind of, okay, what more can we learn? So appreciate that.
So one of the areas that we immediately started with was to say, okay, there are ways in which we can align with medical practice standards that are requirements for licensure. And if we can build that into their standardized processes, and you're going to hear this theme a lot of build into or integrate into other people's processes, because what that does is it essentially removes the friction, that there's a path of least resistance, which an organization tends to gravitate toward. And the more that we can build into the processes that exist, the more that it reinforces that very structure that is already used. So licensure was a perfect way to do this. And at the point of privileging, right, and I'm sure you all are very aware of this, that in Catholic healthcare, there's a variety of approaches to educating our clinicians on the ERDs. Some have taken the perennial approach of, here's a copy, let us know if you have any questions, right? And there's others that we have, and we're, again, only more recently moving to this, but devote standardized required education of our clinicians across the entirety of our system in a systematic way that focuses on key areas. And to build on that, the development of specialized education that's standardized for areas where there may be more practice implications for the ethical and religious directives themselves. But finding this type of access point for us gave us an incredible opportunity to say, okay, if we can align with professionalism, licensure, and as the conduit, we can now insert into their process an important aspect of lifting up obligations to fertility awareness-based methods. Elliott, any comments on that from a practice standpoint?
No, I think, and this is one of the things I think that this is really important about, is that it's pretty much universal across all clinicians. So it is a kind of easy access point or common point of practice. They understand it, they're committed to it on a personal and professional level. So it's not simply about an institution coming in and asking them to do something that they may or may not agree with. This is something that they have committed to as a professional core to who they are, in terms of offering in the conversation with their patients those options that help the patient make an informed decision. So it's very fruitful entry point. And the other thing that we would like to say is pointing this out is something that's very much promoted by the ethical and religious directives, and what we'll get into that dimension of it. But before we go a little further, I want to help get a baseline on what we mean by the informed consent kind of conversation as the entry point at which the healthcare system is the optimal entry point or promotion point for the healthcare system with regard to advancing fertility awareness as in accordance with the Church's teaching. So here's the kind of basic definition of what informed consent actually means. And it really is a way of respecting the dignity of every human individual to be able to make their own decisions in freedom, and to be able to provide this informed consent. That physicians and clinicians need to be able to, one, give appropriate information to the patient such that they can then freely choose based on a comprehension of the information, the alternatives they've been presented, and then they have to have this basic kind of capacity to make decisions. So you can have things like patients who are not able to consent to an intervention because they are minors, and that means they don't have decision-making competency. So it's a legal definition. While they might be able to understand kind of the information that they're being presented on some level, they don't have that competency. But then once you reach your age of majority, you are both competent, presumed competent, and capacitated, which means you have the legal ability to make decisions and the psychological capacity to be able to understand information, process it, and then choose a plan of care. So that's the baseline for what we're talking about in terms of informed consent, is being able to have patients well informed of their alternatives and making free choices to be able to choose what their plan of healthcare should be. So this slide goes into a little bit more about the details of which the physician or the healthcare provider is obligated to provide to the patient in professionalism. So things such as the diagnosis, that is, if it's known, the various different treatments and their objectives, their purposes, the risks and benefits of proposed treatments. This is a really important one that is, I'll say, a very, very significant in terms of being able to disclose, and then as a patient you get to weigh the risks and benefits of any proposed treatment. I already said risk and benefit of alternatives, and then also the option of no treatment or undergoing procedures is always a legitimate thing that needs to be presented. So what I hope you get here is informed consent is not merely a documentation process, right? Sign this form. The form is really meant to be designed to capture or encapsulate the more robust discussion that you're supposed to have with your clinical provider.
And here's why this
important piece that we really do emphasize is this conversation has to be authentic, it has to be real, it can't be just checking a box.
And here's the important piece relative to the topic, right? We needed that lever from a systems-based approach to be able to say, where can we lean into that is going to be a standardized process that is required of all clinicians when the conversation of responsible parenthood comes up, infertility, fertility, all of those discussions, what can we lean into? And what we found was that we were seeing the inadequacy, just to be quite honest, of what is required of informed consent relative to the absence of FABM being introduced. In other words, the sole scope of what was often discussed was, as Elliott pointed out, kind of the norm that we encounter, which is hormone-based intervention, right? Or discussions related to fertility that is basically maybe surgical in nature or other. Never a full and rich and robust conversation that included all understandings of the way in which that particular intervention can meet the needs of what the patient is coming for. And quite frankly, it came up in astonishing ways. We would be doing childbirth classes, right? And we would hear from our educators in the childbirth classes that a number of the pregnant women in those childbirth classes were saying, after I give birth to my child, do I have options that I can use besides this hormone-based therapy? And they're like, wait, we can have so much more exposure to this. Was that not discussed with you? Did your physician not rate? And there were all of these gaps, again, thinking back to the system-based approach, there were all these gaps in the knowledge transfer. Now, what we also realized when we went back and talked with our physicians to say, okay, Why is this knowledge gap occurring? My goodness, we had the full gamut. We had, I don't feel comfortable talking about this, to I'm not sure I understand the science fully, to unfortunately, some responses were, well, that's just ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
And go ahead, Elliott.
To that point, Mark, a lot of these, when we look at the systems-based approach, recognize that are there factors that would lead to those kind of gaps, whether it's comfort, whether it's knowledge, whether it's understanding of the science, they're outside of our control as a health system. So, for instance, the medical school system, the various residencies that our physicians might have come from, that might be the source why, but the impact is on inside our system and saying, for whatever reason, here's the gaps. So just being able to understand, and I'm sure that you all know, these are the same things that you hear from couples going through marriage prep, for instance, of saying, well, I never heard my physician say that, right? My wife's a fertility care practitioner, and she's working with, marriage prep couples, that she hears that a lot. So that's to say that there might be sources of those gaps outside, but that doesn't lessen our obligation inside the system to be able to uphold these respect for the dignity of the patient by providing informed consent. And you can see that here emphasized time and time again in the Ethical and Religious Directive. This is something that this document, the Ethical and Religious Directive, distills Catholic moral teaching and applies certain elements of it to how health systems should operate. So that is something that is normative and guiding how we operate. And this is really the bedrock for how we begin our kind of reformulating our approach to engaging the clinicians, is to say, let's look at the principles of informed consent that the Ethical and Religious Directives are calling us to live out. And how do we work together to help apply those.
And I think the key here, and then we'll kind of move into some of the practical implications of the systems-based approach. But so often what we see in Catholic healthcare is pointing in the direction of ERD 52. And that's where the focus is, right? And that's the only place that's looked to kind of anchor this important work. Our connection here to this fundamental tenet of medical practice helped us bring to the realization of this is that very sacred space between the clinician and the patient. And in order to meet the expectations of what is asked, informed consent is what anchors it for you. So let's now focus on how do we give you all the resources necessary so that you can carry out this important conversation with the patient and it meets your level of expertise. We're not asking everyone to be certified in a particular method. What we are asking is that you can meet the fundamental tenets of informed consent. And in doing so, that might mean you refer the patient to some practitioner within your group that has the expertise. It might mean that we can train up more individuals to be able to get certain types of certification. It might mean that there are baseline thresholds of information that we want to then realize we need to give you and resource for you to bring up your own competencies to that level. Or broadest vision, right, which we're only beginning to embark on, how can we meet this expectation both internally and externally? And in some, Elliott has done some great work in leadership in the Kansas market as well, where we're beginning to partner with diocesan resources to say, we as clinicians have this, but here's where you may be wanting to go then for the expertise in this particular space. So again, it's the connection between these two that helped us so significantly. So what might that look like in terms of actual implementing of resources? Well, one of the key pieces that has helped us is our partnership with FACS. Now, I know all of you know Dr. Duane very well, and she's been doing incredible work for years with FACS. But what that partnership did for us in particular is help us focus on that insight that we had around meeting the fundamental tenets of informed consent with the resources that a clinician to clinician are communicating as the effective way to bring the information to the patient. That's where FACS, its primary mission is to be able to provide clinicians with that information. For some, This is brand new to our clinicians. And what we loved about it is that it level set their own understanding. When they start looking at efficacy rates, when they start looking at methodologies, when they start looking at this just as a shared decision-making guide, in the clinical world, these shared decision-making guides are all over the place in so many areas and so many modalities. This gave us the practitioner-to-practitioner conversation. Having Dr. Duane and her wealth of knowledge in this space so that it's doctor-to-doctor communication, clinician-to-clinician communication, and then a resource that's digestible and a starting point for patients to be able to utilize as they either engage in this conversation with their clinician, tee up this conversation as kind of one of many forthcoming conversations, or just want to know what do I have, what's out there, right? And then it's not simply a matter of the brochure in the waiting room, right? Again, thinking about systems processes. We said, okay, that's one way, but it's not the most effective way. And so we went back to the clinicians and said, okay, let's look at workflow. When a patient comes to you and this topic comes up, what do you do? How do you use the EMR effectively? Well, there's a protocol I need to move through. Fantastic. Where in that protocol is a resource for you on shared decision-making guides related to FABM? Well, we don't have one. Awesome. We've got one for you, right? And not only do we have one for you, so you don't have to figure it out yourself, it's grounded in the literature. And what we can tell you is not only here are the evidence-based citations to the data points that are here, so that if you want to learn more, you can. But here's also the literature on how when this guide is used more effectively, how this fundamentally impacts the patient-physician relationship. And when they start hearing that as well, the bells and whistles that go off is, oh, greater patient satisfaction. I'm all in, right? And so it's multiple motivating factors and being able to move that. The final piece that became so helpful for us when we talk about that patient flow is we started to say, okay, and this speaks to, again, our own limitations. This can't be on an ethicist. This can't be on a clinician one-on-one every single time. We need a systems-based approach. So we turn to clinical transformation. What that is a fancy term for the people that basically build everything into the EMR that's hardwired. And by building it into the patient flow that's hardwired into the EMR, it basically scripts that visit for that particular clinician who is engaging that patient. By building it into clinical transformation, it gave them the methodological flow, it gave them the one-click access to the resource, and what we were able to hardwire in is when this conversation comes up and it's documented, it automatically produces this shared decision-making guide as part of the patient summary as they leave. So it's literally everywhere, right? Coming, and it's not a push. And that's the other key piece. So much of what we were trying to do before was you'd have to pull, meaning it was incumbent upon me as practitioner to remember to make these things happen. What we've done now is we've created a series of prompts that are part of the natural processes of how, or the flows that physicians engage patients in. And when they do that, these things automatically get pushed both to the patient and the clinician as an automated resource, and one that, again, is evidence-based. So a huge piece for us in terms of kind of an aha moment to how we can support our clinicians in this work. Elliott, anything I'm missing there?
No, it's well covered. And like I said, the end goal is to make it easy for the clinicians and ultimately for the patient to be able to receive the information, in a, I'll say, widely distributable way. And this worked out. I mean, it was a long time coming for us to get that level of clarity of where to put this all, but ultimately it's a great starting point.
And what we realized too is that, we started to be able to tie a lot more of the directives. And again, we keep coming back to this, but for us, it's kind of a major guiding document for us to anchor a lot of the whys, right? And for us to now be able to say, hey, look, the patient populations that may not have access to a variety of different approaches, if they're not given the information that's necessary, how can they possibly be able to incorporate this into decision making? Absent the information, they're incredibly vulnerable. And if they're incredibly vulnerable, it fits into categories in which we have a special call to correct those inequities in the very structures, which again reinforces that idea of changing systems to meet the needs of the patient. So what
Yeah. On that
go ahead,
point, I
sorry.
would just like to emphasize, Mark, that because we've rooted our approach in the informed consent side of the moral obligation, what that has allowed us to do is to expand the conversation for fertility awareness and its value that it brings to patients. So it's not merely about the moral regulation of birth. It becomes about women's health in general, and specifically the knowledge that they can have of their own fertility system and the various different things that you can learn about, pathologies, endometriosis, so on and so forth, that are beyond the scope of, for instance, Humanae Vitae, right? But I would say, and we've kind of adopted this mentality of this is information that women have a right to know about their own body. And it's a fruitful way to begin conversation because it doesn't have the same baggage, I'll say, from a clinical standpoint. But the idea of women have a right to know about their own body and how it works and how it can become healthy. And this is an avenue for helping to learn about that. It expands beyond the traditional conversation of, well, would you like to avoid pregnancy? Here's how, here's a variety of different methods, into a focus on very much we should be promoting health. We should be promoting knowledge. And that is I'll say, a very fruitful door to be opening in terms of being able to advance this work and have a clinical respectability.
And it also just, I mean, not to make this solely focused on, or that the burden should be borne entirely by the woman, but some of the work that Dr. Duane is doing around ensuring that there's a way in which men then can clearly understand how they can be supportive in this process and their own gaps in knowledge, their own lack of awareness. In addition to, as Elliott said earlier, I think Marguerite has this phenomenal piece that she does on the fifth vital sign, right? Mm-hmm. Speaking to women's health in general, how just that awareness can be so much more profound instead of simply addressing a issue in a myopic way. So some other system solutions here. One of the things that we realized then is we said, okay, we think we have a successful approach that we can implement. We've got broad consensus by a number of leaders across the system to be able to deploy this. How do we now do so in a way that actually can check to see if the market, meaning, within Ascension, we categorize basically our state geographies by markets. How can we determine that a market is kind of ready for this approach, right? Because the worst thing we can have is we launch what we think is a great idea, but the launch pad itself has not been well prepped, to stretch that metaphor a bit. And so what we really did is we said we need to have, as opposed to kind of like, here's the work, we now understand what to do, go do it. We need to have what we call a readiness checklist. So what that looks like for us is to say, are all of these essential elements in place such that we can now say, the market itself is at the point where they will be ready to receive the insights that we've gained and move this initiative forward. It also helps us prioritize. In a system as large as we are, it can't be all markets at once, right? We just don't have the bandwidth for that. What it also does is it allows us to, as we begin to bring some of these markets online with this type of systems-based approach, we learn so much from each one that we can take those learnings and apply it to the next market. And each market is new. We have, Elliott can speak to this, and I know he will later, the challenges that he faced in Indiana were not at all the challenges he faced in Kansas. And the gains that he faced in and partnerships he had in Kansas may not necessarily be those that he has in Indiana. So what this allowed us to do is say, what does readiness look like? Do we have, for us, our highest level mission integration support and highest level clinical lead support? Those are our Chief Mission Integration Officer, the CMIO, and the AMG President, aligned with the timing of this strategy. Great. If we do, then Are we ready to confirm implementation and alignment within clinical market leadership? AMG present, Chief Medical Officer, Chief Clinical Officer, the CMOs of our Ascension Medical Group, that's the AMG, and then market level chairs in each of the areas where we know this topic already comes up and we want to address this systematically. Okay, great. Now we've got the people in place. Now let's make sure that we have the resources ready. So we've got a FABM FAQ that we've established and done in collaboration with Dr. Dwayne and her team. We just showed you an example of the fact share decision-making resource. Do we have that already anchored? Because again, it's gonna be no surprise to you, at one point we had 7 different EMRs across our system. So we had Epic, Cerner, and the whole list goes on. Are they integrated into every process, into every EMR, into the outpatient, as well as potentially other areas? Do we have that seamlessly done? We then also added, and this has been extremely helpful for our clinicians, is a dot phrasing so that they can get the documentation that they don't have to try to remember every single time to ensure proper coding, and therefore proper coding, proper information that we can track from a data and maintenance standpoint. So we know who our champions are, right? So that we can go back and look and say, oh my gosh, this is fantastic. Look at the saturation that we've had in this particular market, and we've been able to change practice, evidence-based, right? After we deployed this, how much did we see prescribing go up? How much did we see incidents, CPT and ICD-10 codes go up relative to this particular area? The dot phrasing helped us get the documentation in the EMR so that it's coded correctly. And then how do we do ongoing education and communication in this space? This was a key piece for us to say, if we don't have if we don't have this full suite of resources ready to go, we are not ready to deploy in this market. That then helped us not have a message of, oh yeah, we tried that already, right? Oh yeah, we've done that, it doesn't work. We were now able to change the narrative and say, we may have tried that in the past, but what we tried was incredibly episodic. It may have been disconnected, or it may have been contingent upon a few really dedicated and wonderful people in this space, but not able to meet the expectations of what we need here. I want to make sure that I'm attending to the chat. There was a comment here. Oh, okay, sorry. There will be a recording, so we'll be able to kind of work through that. So we want to talk a little bit of some of our experience in 4 markets and what a approach to this can look like in a few of them. And we're just going to highlight these kind of from some practical standpoint. And then we want to make sure that we're attentive to your time as well to make sure that we have plenty of time for Q&A. Elliott, you want to highlight a few of these that have been successful for us in terms of sustained system approaches?
Yeah, so the Indiana market is definitely one that I've been the nearest and most involved with. And a lot of the elements that we've talked about already are direct experiences from Indiana. So the variety of different reasons why physicians were feeling like they couldn't adequately talk about fertility awareness in patient context, things about how to provide that informed consent, definitely one of those. But what we've done is we've been able to build up through finding this relationship with Dr. Dwayne, but then also finding kind of like key, if you want to call them leaders who are willing to be able to advance the policies and the practices that we just outlined in that assessment. As part of, we've just got good collaboration from our administrative leadership here to be able to implement the systems-based approach. One of the ways that we kind of distinctive in that approach is something that you see on the screen here is finding a way to provide education and information to, for instance, our residency. We have an OBGYN residency, we have a family medicine residency here, and we were able to, through our partnership with FACS, develop a presentation that was case-based, that utilized one of our residents, and coupled with Dr. Dwayne to be able to do a presentation that made the art and science of applying fertility awareness very practical, exactly what the residents wanted to. So this was based out of Indiana, but because of Ascension's national scope, we were able to present that ground rounds across the country to our other residents. So that was a really good collaborative way, rather than just find kind of information that was floating out there in the ether. This is one way where we said, this is something Ascension is wanting to promote, and we're finding key partners to be able to help advance the work in a really critical population, which is the residencies, so that we could help limit that knowledge gap. So that,
I think
that
from
was earlier this year, and I felt very good about it.
Yeah, just to emphasize the scale of this that Elliott brought up. The latest data that we have, I think we are the second largest residency, from a residency standpoint, the second largest program in the entire country. So the number, I think, Elliott, I want to be close. We definitely had 100+ residents on this particular grand rounds. And what this did is, again, building into other people's processes. This wasn't the first time ethics grand rounds was done on this scale. Thanks to my colleagues and others, we've built this idea of ethics grand rounds as a quarterly deliverable to all residents across the country. So on a number of topics. But what we're able to do then is plug into a process we don't even own. It's graduate medical education. ACGME, meeting those standards, that helps our clinicians who lead this, the entire program itself around GME, and now the fact that we have and we can deliver this particular topic in that context gave us an automatic avenue and inroads into a structure that already existed. So incredibly helpful there.
Yep.
Some of the other areas. Oh, I'm so sorry about that. I don't know what just happened.
So in the Kansas market, I'll go on a little bit there. We've had a little bit of a different approach because what we have there is actually a large amount of trained in Creighton model, actually, providers. And the ability to have somebody on the medical residency faculty to be able to provide kind of oversight and clinical exposure to the practice of fertility awareness has been a distinguishing feature, because one, it helps attract residents to that group, makes fertility awareness education regular as part of just or regularly available, and it's not, again, like a learning module that you go out and just do, even though those are options that we want to make available to people. This is, you have the opportunity to work with Dr. Lisa Gilbert and a variety of other physicians there. And that has allowed us to think about how do we, increase the collaboration between our providers, the diocese out there in Wichita, and then also the residency themselves, so that we're mutually reinforcing one another. It's a nice problem to have.
So then beyond residents, we want to make sure we can do the same thing for our clinicians. So leveraging these member benefits now, we are a platinum member in FACS, and what that gives us is access to CME that meets the clinician where they're at. If they need a baseline understanding of all methods, no problem. Here's a CME module that you can take online. And it's, again, led by those who have expertise in this space. We don't have to create anything. We don't have to add anything. It's all right there and available through a portal that they create. If we want to have an educational directory, what are the additional topics that you might want? What are the additional resources that you might be able to gain beyond the shared decision-making resource? How can we connect you with, promote those, and support you in giving you the time and the space to be able to provide, have that education? And what this does is it gives us a way to be able to move through all of these different methods and resources and provide evidence-based education in the different methods for those clinicians who want to kind of move beyond, okay, I've got a baseline understanding. So we are hopefully at every step of the way meeting the clinician where they're at. If it's baseline informed consent, great, we've got the resources for you and the infrastructure that we can deploy across the system. If you want to move to the next level, here are the ways in which you can help us strategically move a practice, a market, a group toward knowing who can be their person and go to for referrals. the beautiful thing about doing this internally, and I know this gets a little bit into the nuts and bolts of healthcare systems, but the minute we'd have to refer out for that, there's the potential loss of the patient to a new relationship. We don't want that. So again, thinking about systems and processes that we have to have internal to us to ensure that we can keep that patient, their family, connected to us as a health system means we need to meet them where they're at. And in order to do that, by providing that information, having expertise and resources internal, the patient stays within our system and stays within the care that we can provide, which is a huge, huge piece for us. So, we've only kind of scratched the surface on kind of where we're headed. It's not perfect. We don't want to give the impression like, oh gosh, we've solved every market and this is going perfectly. I can say though that in a number of markets that we've deployed this, most specifically Texas, Indiana, and Kansas, we are making great strides in terms of this systematic approach to the success of this work and seeing demonstrably and empirically the amount of encounters with patients, because we have the data management tool to support it, increase as a result of this systematic approach. And that to us is giving us the evidence we need to bolster not only continuing our relationship with facts, but evidence to suggest that this is doing the work we needed to do. Patients are getting the information, they're receiving full and informed consent, and to the extent that we're, again, like I said, hopefully next steps, we can now connect them more effectively with the resources that we have known, not only internal to our organization, but those at the diocesan level. So again, thank you so much for this time. Comments, thoughts, questions, concerns?
Mark and Elliott, Tori here from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I have two questions. One, in regards to your collaboration with FACS, does that make those CMEs available then to all your clinicians at no additional cost to them, or is there still a cost component for them? And then second, I have a number of Ascension clinicians that I know are already practicing incorporating NFP and FABMs into their practice, and I can just like anticipate the questions they might have when I share this with them. If they wanted to get in contact with you or help make this a sooner reality in our Milwaukee area, is there a way that I can help them, help you, help all of us?
Yeah, no, great question. So thank you for the collaborative spirit, right? I mean, so the market readiness strategy. So hopefully this isn't a new conversation, right? I actually am from Milwaukee, so I have a bit of a bias here. I was at Columbia St. Mary's for 12 to 15 years. So this is near and dear to my heart, and a lot of the clinicians that I'm sure we could rattle off pretty quickly are the ones that have been strong advocates for this for a long, long time in their practice. I think the difference here, though, is, right, you know this well. It usually used to be, well, we know who the names are, and we know, like, if you need help, refer to these 3 or 4 docs, right? The approach here, to answer your first question, is yes, all ships rise. So from a membership standpoint, the reason why we wanted to go with the level of membership that we do is that for a number of the baseline modules, it's when you have time, click on it, take it, CME, boom, free, right? We have, as a system, and again, this is part of that approach, we as a system are going to own the financial burden of making this available to you, right? And in the past also, I'll just be frank, I don't have the expertise in this space. This is not mine to do. Like I can help connect all the dots, but I am not the one who should be doing the education, right? And the more powerful is to have somebody like Dr. Dwayne or her, I mean, Dr. Scrafford, Stanford, all of these doctors that have such a command of the material, national recognition, international recognition, speaking to other clinicians, right? Otherwise, it's not meeting them where they're at. To your question around kind of excited to kind of how can we partner? This is where I think that in some markets, we did have to temper the excitement a little bit. And what I mean by that is if we're going to ensure that we can move in an aligned way so that we don't bypass all of these things that we know are essential elements to building a program like this, we're going to run into some of the same problems we ran into in the past, which is it kind of fails. Why? Because we tend to lean in then to the familiar faces instead of kind of getting all ships to rise and setting the expectation of what needs to occur such that the resources become more plentiful, the partnerships are there, the infrastructure is in place so that we can ensure we don't need everyone to be experts, but we do need to be able to say that we can meet patient expectation on this level. And I want to make sure we can do that, because otherwise we might unintentionally be feeding the narrative, see, I told you so, this wasn't going to work, right? And that's the immediate disaster. So I would say to that end, I know this isn't what you want to hear, but maybe it's a little bit of waiting with the knowledge that you know that this is forthcoming, and that what we're trying to do is build that momentum around how can we do this well and right, so that it's not just a few that are leading, but that we have the systems and the processes and the infrastructure in place to say, now let's pull the lever and kind of release this and be able to say, here's the new approach. And Elliott, you can speak to a number of ways in which we've tried the latter, and it just kind of, with all due respect, he's done incredible work, but there's been a few of these like, oh, finally, after 5 years, we're going. And then 6 months later, it was person dependent. Boom, crash.
Well, to that point, Tori, this has been, I'll say, a personal point of learning in faith, that we work on God's timeline and not our own individually. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here about that, but this is a very good example of once you kind of give that over and say, God, not only like, do I want what you want, but I want how you want it. I want the way that you want it. That's been a big struggle for me in this particular field. And I have seen the fruit born. But one of the key pieces I would say is stay in relationship, right? So stay in relationship with all the people that you just mentioned, with the Ascension Wisconsin personnel as well. Maintain those relationships so that, like Mark's saying, once we have the ground prepared, it is opportune time to go out and be able to initiate stuff. That is how I've seen it play out in both of the markets that I work, is to be able to maintain relationships and prayerfully watch and slowly build. But it is one of those things that you do see windows of opportunity come for an advancement. Like the relationship that we have with FACS is something that has been growing over time for several years now, through myself, through Mark, and all of a sudden FACS developed this institutional membership, which was not a feature that they had previously. And now that they have that up and running, we have this opportunity to be able to take it and incorporate it into various different ways we operate. A wonderful new possibility. We couldn't have done it without that, quite frankly. We couldn't even get to this stage without that. So that all it is to say is hopeful waiting is what I would say. Hopefully that comes across. Good question.
Thank you. Can we have Armida from Diocese of Phoenix? She has a question.
Thank you, Theresa. I'm sorry I arrived late, so please forgive me if I'm asking something that perhaps you covered. Actually, I think I'm going to deviate a little bit. So Mark and Elliott, you tell me if this is for another meeting, but I hope you invite them again, Theresa. What about the clinics that already want to do this? And I'm talking specifically about the clinics that we call crisis pregnancy centers, that are now trying to do medical clinics, things like that. Here in Phoenix, we have, I can think of 3 beautiful places that I just don't seem to get traction with NFP. We just, I used to work for one of them for 12 years, and I cannot tell you how many women passed through my office, and I sat down, I taught them, they had my time, everything, and maybe out of 10 that I would see, 1 would actually consider visiting me a second time. It was just slow in moving. So do you have any, besides actually just telling the directors to contact you, obviously, do you have any suggestions?
Mark, I'll go first here. My experience, and part of this is from the work at the hospital, And part of this is, again, watching my wife's practice as a fertility care practitioner and kind of like her direct patient experience there. So I'll have to check with her if I get anything that's wrong. But there is this, since we've reframed it into an informed consent approach, it's very consistent with her approach of, I'm here to present you information and an opportunity for you to be able to utilize this. It does depend upon the free choice of the patient at minimum, right? Now, what hopefully you heard today is even getting to the point of being able to provide accurate, accessible information readily to all patients, that's a big movement in the culture. So we're still fighting that piece, right? And I would say in those pockets that I've seen where we've overcome those things of limitations around information, where you start to see patients who are regularly available, like that's something like at my parish, lots of families have access to that information, and then you have the families actually utilizing it to be able to live it out, not just for regulation of birth, but also for treating endometriosis and PCOS and all that kind of stuff, where it becomes normalized. Then you see the growth of, oh, it is definitely something that's a viable option, not just something that I heard about at the physician, but my neighbor down the street, we go to the same physician, and now, or I've seen referrals to these physicians precisely because, oh, I have painful periods, oh, I've got the endometriosis, I think, or infertile, and you see it grow. But the first thing is, we got to get the information out there. And again, I'm preaching to the choir here when I say that, I know that, but it really is, we're overcoming this, or closing this gap that we have to work on as a health system. And it's harder, I would say, for those individual clinics, because they're just, one little ship out on this huge ocean. And what we're trying to do is say, okay, well, we've got a Titanic here in terms of, or a very large ship in Ascension. Hopefully it's not sinking. But the idea of this is a big thing that's we've got to be able to shift the culture here. We're doing it. It's going to take time, but that hopefully will create this permeation of knowledge for patients on a scale such that it would then become normalized. I don't know if that speaks to what you're talking about, Armida, but like that's what I've seen in my practice.
It sounds to me as if your work, I think you could probably extrapolate a generic outline of a map of work for people out there in the dioceses when you're ready to do it, because not every diocese is going to have a massive healthcare system that they've got accessible to it. I'm sure there is still some diocesan hospitals that are still up and running, or even maybe practices of doctors that are a group of Catholic doctors, or maybe just a good pro-life group of doctors who are in need of education about natural family planning methods, the science and the methods and all of that. And it seems to me that if you develop a matrix that can be layered on any structure, that would be so helpful for people, because I didn't realize how deeply a person needs to know who the stakeholders are in a hospital setting. I just kept thinking, oh, they must have an education department, as the hospital that I was familiar with when I was in New Jersey, where I grew up, because there was always an education department. I didn't realize the importance of really understanding that entire structure and who one needs to speak with, and also how to get into already existing structures that physicians need to plug into. So that's just brilliant. And it really is wonderfully efficient and helpful, because you're not only getting into the professional structure, but you're planting really deep seeds of good truth that can help convert people. And as you said, transform the culture.
I do.
Does anyone else are muted? Did you have a second part of your question?
Yes, if you don't mind. So just something closer to home, which is us as as diocesan coordinators. I think that the most contact the context that I have the most is with clients that happen to be doctors or nurses. Or so what is the easiest way for me to we had case in point, we had a young just recently graduated doctor she got in touch with us. I moved in Phoenix and here I am, kind of thing. And we invited her for lunch, told her about our office, and then just kept in touch with her. And we've been sending her clients when they have trouble, when we find they have trouble while they are in our care to teach them NFP. But I know that she's doing this on her own. So now that I hear you, I know I'm going to send her to you. But is that really just the best way when we encounter these clients as they come in as clients, just to say, hey, let me send you to this place so that you know how to utilize, what because these are pro NFP people. Is that the best way for us to do? Just send them over your way?
I think one of the things, let me answer your question in a little bit of a roundabout way.
Mm-hmm.
And it points back to, I think, Theresa's kind of, and I really appreciate it, Theresa, kind of the aha moments around systems and our own insight on that. And this is meant to be an objective statement, not meant to be pejorative or a critique. I have the privilege of teaching in medical school, and I understand, what we're seeing when our residents come to us. They just want to be really great clinicians, right? And they just want to make sure that they're getting this right. And then they want to be great doctors, and they want to make sure that they're meeting their patients' needs, right? Their education on the depth and breadth of the system that surrounds them to ensure that that can all happen effectively is not really well known. Right? And you can hear that in their voice to say, look, I just want to take care of patients. You guys in the suits, you take care of the rest. Right? And that's fine. But all of that infrastructure is what helps to make the work that you do, hopefully, and I keep coming back to this word, but as frictionless as possible, that it enables you to focus on that patient in front of you and do that great work. So part of what I'm suggesting to you is that it's to help create a healthy level of curiosity among that physician to begin asking questions of, well, how does my system do X, Y, or Z? One of the things that I have to tell you is astounding to me is when I'm sitting in birthing class, trying to support my wife as we're kind of getting ready for this, and she's an L&D nurse, so she's mostly just telling me to be quiet. She's like, I know this, just we'll be fine. And I'm like, oh, I got some questions. But in that class, the number of people that were asking about opportunities to not have to use a LARC after they, as if standard of care, a LARC, boom, I'm done having a child, and they're going to put the device in. Well, whoa, time out. Like, hold on. When did that become not only standard of care, but the expectation that if it's not done, somehow clinicians are not meeting expectation? It's like, whoa, time out. Those systems and processes that are sometimes in place aren't even known well to the clinician. And so if they know access points like a childbirth education class to realize that there's a lack of awareness or understanding, they now can become incredible partners in their own systems work to try to achieve and meet expectation. And that way it also reduces this person-dependent approach, which, quite frankly, many of our clinicians describe as a burden that they do not want to carry alone. And it just becomes like, oh my God, I can't change the system. I can't change. I'm just going to take care of the patient in front of me and do this best I can.
Really want to echo Mark's point there about where you see the most change, most effective, is this approach where the clinicians understand how the systems work from the inside, for instance, and how to be able to tactfully and prudently be able to navigate those systems to be able to say, let's get this in place. So for instance, how do we build a fertility awareness rotation into a family medicine curriculum? That is a very important skill set to be able to say, you need to have the knowledge on how to build the system here to make this effective, versus kind of just go in and say, like, here's my demands. That's not, necessarily the most appropriate way. So like I said, there's this knowledge that comes from the systems thinking that really does allow for us to be prudent and be able to advance and shift the culture like we were just talking about. And I think that's some people, that's not what they're called to, right? Some people are called to go start their own independent clinic, and that's what they need. But I would be willing to bet that the Lord is calling some people to be able to do exactly what Mark was just talking about, and understand and appreciate the systems that we have, and how to integrate into those.
Oh, good grief. As you guys were talking, I could think of three people: a nurse, a PA, and a physician that were my clients for marriage preparation. They were all excited about the method and they left all gung-ho, but I hear you talking, I'm going, I send them to doom. Just like, so I think I know who I'm going to contact after this meeting to see how they're doing. I myself did not realize that is not just being all committed to actual to teaching this, but it's also all these things that come behind. So
I'm going to use a bit more of a terse phrase here, because it's something Elliott and I commiserated about for a long time. We were just trying to cheer this thing into action, right?
Yeah.
No, there's not enough cheerleaders. Sorry, it just ain't going to work.
That's true.
And the great work that you all do, and this is why I'm so thankful to Theresa to kind of bring us in connection with you, because we also know that as we look for our next step, as I mentioned at the beginning, what we've done with all of our directors is we've asked them to go and connect with, if the diocese within which we have the healthcare facilities has a program and a director, what's that information? How do we contact them? What are the resources the diocese has, so that we can begin to start visioning what next steps look like? So that it's not just you having to come to us all the time saying, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? Right? And now it's hopefully at some, early stages, we can come to all of you and say, okay, in these 3 or 4 dioceses, here's what we have to offer. Here's the bench strength we have and the baseline we've established. How does this fit into what you're already trying to do, and how can we collaborate? I see that as blossoming. And to Elliott's point earlier, it's timing and patience, right? But I think, you all have been working so hard to make this happen on your end, and it's got to be so frustrating and hard to get into the system and figure out, how can I help the system do? Well, I think Theresa, you were very kind to use the word earlier. I'm going to say it back to you. The genius of what you're suggesting here and having this conversation and inviting us into this space is it's health systems talking to the diocese. How can we work together? And hopefully we can open doors as well then. So we're getting there. Patience with us too, please, though.
Just a couple of comments that I'd like to throw in. A number of years ago, I did a survey of the dioceses, asking them about their inclusion of Catholic doctors and also Catholic healthcare professionals, nurses, PAs, etc., and their involvement in the natural family planning programs in the dioceses. And there was a common thread of frustration that came out in that survey, where the coordinators felt that they didn't have the expertise to speak to these people. They felt that in order to go to new doctors, they needed converted doctors to be arm in arm with them. That was very inconsistent a number of years ago. I know that we've gotten stronger in some dioceses, but I know some other dioceses are still struggling on that front. And we've always said in my office from the beginning of its inception that natural family planning ministry is an unusual, it's very unique ministry in the dioceses, because it wears a double hat of ministry, because we're doing this because of the sacrament of marriage and the relationship of the couples and the building up of the family and our church teachings. But we're also doing fertility education, and we're reaching out to a medical field to partner with us that's basically not there or not there consistently. So the work that you're doing is magnificent for us, and it gives us a structure to hang on to. So I would say keep moving forward, because that next phase is here, or it's coming soon, right? In any case, I don't want to keep you further. We're already over our meeting by 15 minutes or so. So I would like to end with a prayer, and thanking both Mark and Elliott for joining us. And I'm sure there will be, as you suggested, some future sessions where we can dive in a little deeper on specific topics. And so again, thank you. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Again, God bless. Thank you.